I'm Henrik. I'm originally trained. I'm a clinical psychologist, a neuropsychologist, in fact. And after that, I'm trained as a Jungian analyst in Copenhagen and London. Besides that, I've been practicing Zen Buddhism since 82. I started out looking for a spiritual tradition, and I tried many different things, and they didn't suit me. So I finally gave up. I was very disappointed that there wasn't anything that fitted for me. And then one evening I was sitting talking to a friend about Zen Buddhism, and I lamented the lack of Zen Buddhist centers in Denmark. And the next day I went to a bookshop, and my eyes were caught by a book called The Three Pillars of Zen, written by an American guy called Philip Kaplow. So I bought the book and decided I had to meet that guy. So I wrote to him and asked if I could come here at a Zen Buddhist monastery in America. And I went over there in 82 and 83 and spent a whole year there in 86. And been going there for sessions, that's 1 week retreats ever since. When I started my Jungian training, I had some vague ideas that if I just worked intensively enough with my dreams, then I might get enlightened. And I soon realized that was absolutely not the case. Actually, I did the same mistake when I started practicing Zen Buddhism. I had this feeling, wow, now I do a 1 week retreat and then I'm there. It's a very humbling experience, as those of you who are meditating probably realized. So I'm still scratching the surface and still trying to reconcile the two traditions, trying to find out what are the similarities and what are the differences. Actually, lately I read in a Danish newspaper, Børsen, that would be the equivalent of Financial Times. One of the headlines was, mindfulness is a big hit on the directory's office, and then you get real worried. Okay, I'm going to talk about Jung and Buddhism. There's been a big interest among psychologists, psychotherapists, deaf psychologists for many years now in the combination of meditation, Buddhism and psychotherapy. And Jung was one of the first, if not the first, Western psychologist who took Buddhism seriously as a method, and he wrote extensively about it. Actually, when Jung was dying on his deathbed, he was reading a book about Zen Buddhism, and he asked his secretary to write to this author and tell him that if he'd understood his book correctly, then this was what he'd been trying to say all his life. But if you look closer at it, then you might ask, is it really so simple? And we are on kind of slippery grounds here. One of the reasons that we're on slippery grounds is that Jung uses the same concepts as we use in Buddhism. For example, Jung talks about the self and the ego, but does he mean the same as they do in Buddhism? I don't think so. Jung distinguishes 3 levels in the psyche. Here's the ego, and the ego is, for Jung, the subject, the conscious part of the psyche. Jung says that consciousness is always connected to the ego. He uses another metaphor, is the light of the psyche. Another classical metaphor is an iceberg, and the tip of the iceberg is the ego. Down below the ego, you have the personal unconscious. Those of you who are familiar with Freudian thinking know that Jung uses this concept the same way as Freud did. The personal unconscious contains either material that you have registered but not been conscious of. For example, you see a color, you notice a person's face expression, but you don't recognize it. But later you might say or think, I think that this person was a bit worried. I wonder if there's something wrong with him or her. In fact, some of what we call intuition, not everything, but part of it comes from these perceptions. The other material in the personal unconscious is things that we repress, wishes, drives, that the ego find embarrassing and suppress. But then Jung adds a third layer, and if we still use the iceberg metaphor, then we have the ego at the top, then we have the personal unconscious, and then the very broad, deep basis, the collective unconscious. And as the name implies, it's a kind of unconsciousness that's common to all people. The The collective unconscious for Jung contains ideas, thoughts, pictures that is common to the whole humanity. He gives a lot of examples. One example from religion could be the dying and resurrecting God, the concept of reincarnation. Jung discovered during his work as a psychiatrist and in his studies of anthropology that these religious ideas kept popping up all over the world at all times, at all places. And that gave him the idea of something in the psyche that was fundamental for everybody. Now in Jungian therapy, there are 3 archetypes, as Jung called these, contains these things that are especially important. It's the shadow and the animus and the self. Jungian analysis, in the classical Jungian analysis, you meet with a client 1, perhaps 2 times a week, and the main focus is on dreams. According to Jung, it's through the dreams that we get in contact with both the personal conscious and the collective unconscious. And it's in our dreams that this unconscious materials comes up and we can work with it. So when you start in analysis, according to Jung, the first layer that you meet, the first archetype, would be what he called the shadow. And the shadow is those parts of your personality that you don't want to acknowledge. For example, aggression. It's very, very classical. I often meet that in my practice, people who come with shadowy dreams. That would typically be you are followed by a gang of robbers or thugs that want to attack you, or there's some very dark force lurking at you in your bedroom. There's someone after you. There's something unpleasant out there, and you run, you try to get away. Sometimes you get stuck, and it gets even more unpleasant. So the first thing you have to do, according to Jung, is to confront your shadow and integrate it. To realize, I have these parts in myself. I'm not wholly good, wholly nice, wholly spiritual. I have these very dark sides too. Then at the next level, if you keep working, you will meet what Jung calls the anima or animus. Anima in men, animus in women. And that would be your opposite gender. In men you will meet your inner women, your inner female side, and a woman will meet her male side. And Jung says that people had a very narrow view of themselves, very restricted view of themselves as either men, very masculine, or women, very feminine. But according to Jung, the work here is to accept and integrate your other gender side. For men to become more feminine, more aware of the feminine sides, for women to become more aware of their masculine sides and integrate them. And finally, if you have worked through your anima animus, you will get in contact with the most basic archetype, the self. But the goal of Jungian psychotherapy is what Jung called individuation. The goal of all psychotherapy, and Jung stressed that repeatedly, is to alleviate suffering. And you can do that in many ways. Sometimes it's very simple. You have a very specific problem, a problem with your relationship, a problem with your work. You have to make an unpleasant choice and you don't know what to choose. And then you can talk with your therapist, and then by looking at your dreams, you get more conscious about what is the problem about, what should I choose, what should I not choose. That's all good and well, but Jung said that there are deeper levels, there are loftier goals. And what Jung offers there is to regain that sense of meaning by getting in contact with the collective unconscious, by getting in contact with a person's own personal myth. And that, says Jung, is done by getting in contact with yourself. And when you hear that as a Buddhist, it sounds very familiar. Now Jung is a very fascinating writer, but he's not always so very, very strict, not always quite clear. And to make things more confusing, Jung often changes his concepts as he gets along. So there's a difference about what he says in 1910 and 1940. So Jung uses the word self in at least 6 different ways. The first is the self as a goal. Jung says the self is the total sum of all the possibilities that a person has in him or her. And he by the way, gives Buddha and Jesus as examples of people who have fully realized themselves. So it's quite a lofty goal. There's a bit of way to go. Yeah. This, what he calls individuation, is a lifelong travel against a goal, and he says it's extremely rare that you reach this goal. So that's the self as a goal. And of course that is something that we could recognize in Buddhism, that you strive for enlightenment, and you can go deeper and deeper and deeper, and it's a never-ending process. When people come to me and start analysis, some people come and have a very lofty aspirations and a very one-sided picture of themselves, and very often the dreams of those people are filled with shadow figures doing evil, terrible things, and people are often quite annoyed of these dreams. Say, why am I dreaming these terrible things? I'm such a nice person. So Jung says it's very important to recognize and integrate your opposites. Of course, that doesn't mean that you should get evil, that you should get a Nazi or anything like that, but you should recognize that you have these sides in you. Then Jung says that the self is a connecting symbol. The symbol is something that expresses a meaning that cannot be put in exact words. And as an example, Jung used mandalas as a symbol of wholeness. The hero can also be a symbol of the self as a wholeness. Then the self can be an agent or a subject, an inner drive. When you suddenly feel that your life is lacking something, you have to change your focus, you have to do something different. You feel dissatisfied with your life. You don't quite know what's wrong, but something is wrong. I had to do something. Then according to Jung, it's yourself who is trying to get you to change your focus. In Buddhism, of course, we don't have an ego. We say the ego is an illusion. Jung wouldn't say that, but he says that in Jungian therapy, you have to let the ego confront or work together with the self so they can both develop. Then, of course, the self can be seen as an archetype, the hero, the god, man, the mandala, and so on. And the self finally can be seen as a superordinate system of the psyche. So, many different meanings, and a bit confusing. Now, Jung repeatedly stresses that he is a scientist, not in the ordinary sense of the word, but still a scientist and a psychologist. And he stresses that he cannot say anything about metaphysics. He cannot say whether God exists or not. And then actually, classical Jung, he did say something about God. There's a very famous interview when Jung was very old, a couple of years before he died. The BBC interviewed Jung, and the interviewer asked, Professor Jung, do you believe in God? And Jung said, no, I know. In his writing, he stresses that he's a scientist, and he cannot say anything scientific about the existence of God or the existence of the absolute. The only thing he can say something about, he says, is the imprint of the absolute in the psyche, and that would be the archetypes. Jung says we can't say anything about what God is. We can't experience it. There's probably something out there. The only thing we can say something about is how do we experience this absolute. If you read the original Jungian papers, it will soon become clear to you that Jung actually, I think you can say he misunderstood Buddhism, or rather he interprets it from his own philosophy, from his own system. Jung is very eager to find proof of his thinking, and he found it in many different places. He was very interested in alchemy too, for example. If you read his writing about his commentary, for example, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, you can see that he sort of translates the Buddhist concepts into his own systems. As a starting point, Jung says, it's quite discouraging for a Westerner, that as Westerners we should read about Buddhism, but we should not practice it. No way. And that's because Jung says that here in the West we have a Western unconscious, a Western collective unconscious, we have a Western tradition, and you can't transfer the Eastern way of thinking, the Eastern concepts, the Eastern archetypes, you can't translate them to the Western thinking. Jung makes some other very sweeping statements about the difference between East and West. For example, he says the Eastern culture is very introverted, it's spiritual, and the Western culture is very extroverted. So, for example, Jung says that the concept as the one mind in Buddhism, Jung says the one mind that resembles the unconscious. To prove that, he says, if you read a description in the Buddhist scriptures of the one mind, it's described as eternal, unknown, you can't see it, it's bright, always existing, it's radiant, it's unobscured. And Jung says, oh yes, that's the unconscious. Because in the unconscious, things are floating and timeless. If you dive down in the unconscious, then you will experience these kind of states. So the one mind is the unconscious. In Buddhism, we say we endlessly circle the six worlds and suffer all the time. And Jung says this, that's a Buddhist description of a neurosis. When you have a neurosis, you always constantly circle around in your mind and you suffer. So this circling the six worlds, Buddhism, that must be the equivalent of a neurosis. Then there's the ego. One of the main sentences in Buddhism is that the ego is on the deepest level an illusion. Of course, on the ordinary level, it's not an illusion. We are all sitting here and listening and we are acting, but if some of you have practiced meditation, especially this kind of meditation, as a Zen meditation, where the focus is who am I, or who is speaking right now, who is listening right now, you can try to do it, who's listening right now, who's looking right now, who's actually sitting there on your pillows or chairs and listening to me right now, who? If you try to look, what do you find? You don't find anything, you don't find anybody. There's not a little man and a little woman sitting in your head. There's a stream of thoughts and sense expressions. But Jung solves that by saying, this non-ego, it's the unconscious. Because, he says, there always have to be a subject to cognize, to recognize. If there's no subject, then you are unconscious. So it's nonsense when the Buddhist scriptures says that you can reach a level, you can experience a mind, state of mind where there's no ego. That's impossible, he says. If you try to do that, then you will slide down into the unconscious. In 1958, shortly before his death, Jung met with a Japanese professor and Zen scholar, Hishimato. And this is what when Hishimato asked Jung, in what you have just said about the unconscious, do you mean that the collective unconscious is something for which we can free ourselves? And then Jung says, yes, it is. And that's the only statement, actually, that Jung have ever made, that it's possible to transcend the collective unconscious. And Jung actually made another statement, which to a Buddhist sound very familiar. It's from his diary, something called the Red Book. It was published last year. It's a very, very strange and very fascinating book. It's based on a series of dreams and visions that Jung had between 1912 and 1918, which he wrote down and he painted them, and then he commented on them afterwards. Even Jung thought that this book was so weird that he forbade anybody to publish it in his lifetime. Because, as he said, people already think I'm a crazy and unscientific, mystical madman, so I have no need to add more to that impression. But 2 years ago, his family gave their consent that it was published. And in this Red Book, there is an extremely strange piece called 7 Sermons for the Dead. Now here, I begin with nothingness. Nothingness is the same as fullness. In infinity, full is as good as empty. Nothingness is empty and full. You You might just as well say anything else about nothingness. For instance, that it's white or black, or that it does not exist, or that it exists. That which is endless and eternal has no qualities, since it has all qualities. Now, this resembles the Heart Sutra, doesn't it? Form is only emptiness, emptiness only form, form is only emptiness, emptiness only form. We are very close, but we are not quite there, because then the next sentence, Jung says, we call this nothingness or fullness the pleroma. And the pleroma is a term he borrowed from Gnosticism. Gnosticism is a group of Christian sects that was later condemned by the church for heresy. And it's based on Platonic thoughts, but still I think we are quite close here to something that a Buddhist might recognize. As you probably guessed, I don't think you can use the classical Jungian writing on Buddhism for so much. It's more of a historical interest today. But it doesn't mean that you can't use Buddhism. I do just think you have to distinguish between meditation and Buddhism. What is what? Meditation, Buddhism, and Jungian psychotherapy. What is what? Perhaps you can distinguish as 3 levels, or layers, areas. There's one you could call the personal level, with all your daily personal problems. Why my wife rude to me? Why do I have problems on my work? How shall I bring up my children? That sort of thing. That's of course what you can work in all kinds of psychotherapy, including the Jungian. Then there's a broader level, what you could call the level of the question of meaning of life. What is the meaning of life? What is the meaning of my life? What is my personal miss? Why am I here? And then the final level, the spiritual level. And on this second level, finding your personal miss, Jungian therapy is very helpful. You should not mix the two things. The psychoanalyst Carl Jung once said that psychotherapy and meditation is not the same, but psychotherapy or psychoanalysis can take you to a place where you can start to practice meditation seriously. Yeah, thank you.